Hello everyone, and welcome to the ALNAP Urban webinar on area-based programming and coordination approaches in urban response. This is going to be a great webinar. I think I can guarantee in advance, one I've certainly been looking forward to. It's a very, very salient, very interesting topic, which I know there's a lot of energy around, and we have some great speakers to discuss it with real experience in how these approaches work, and also with a very thoughtful approach to understanding some of the positives and potentially some of the challenges in implementing area-based programming. So without further ado, let me introduce you to them. Holly Fuller, the first of our discussants, works for Catholic Relief Services, CRS, as the Program Manager for the Typhoon Haiyan Recovery Program. She manages the team who implement individual and community-level interventions in transitional shelter, in WASH, in DRR, and in protection. Holly started her career with CRS in Guatemala in 2011, and she's also managed food security programs and provided programming and M&E support in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And as a discussant, Holly is joined by Andrew Cusack. Now, Andrew's been working with the CCM team to support displaced communities since 2012, and he's currently working as the head of the CCM unit in UNHCR. Andrew's previously worked on emergencies in the Central African Republic, in Turkey, and in Iraq. He holds a master's degree in architecture from the University of Oregon and has previously worked in architecture practice and in design build firms. So we'll be hearing from Holly and Andrew in a minute as they address some of the questions that you've sent in and some of the questions that we hope you will be sending in over the course of the webinar. But we will first go to Elizabeth Parker. Now, Elizabeth is a researcher whose work has focused on urban resilience, on disaster recovery and regeneration across a geographical range of areas, and she's been doing this since completing her MA in Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookes. She originally trained as an architect and then spent 5 years working for Arab, including on the Rockefeller Foundation-funded Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, which condenses, although not very much, to the acronym ACCCRN. Now, Elizabeth is going to start off today's webinar by giving us a review of the excellent report that she recently co-wrote, Humanitarian Response to Urban Crises. She'll be giving us, if you like, the top line. I'm sure many of you will have read it, and certainly if you haven't got round to it, we really do recommend that you take a look at it if you're at all interested in this topic. But knowing that time is short for everyone, Elizabeth has kindly agreed to give us an introduction to the session by introducing this paper. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Hello, thank you, and thank you, Paul, for that introduction. On behalf of Victoria Maynard and myself, we're really pleased to be able to present to everybody today, and thank you to Leah and her team for inviting us. Our paper is called A Humanitarian Response to Urban Crises, a review of area-based approaches, and it's hot off the press, and it's just been published this month. The purpose of the paper was twofold. It was an initial rapid review of the available literature, both in order to synthesize the findings and also to identify gaps in documentation, knowledge for further research. We had 4 key research questions. We were asked to answer what are area-based approaches to urban humanitarian crises. That was a critical question. In order to then answer the next 3, why are they being adopted? What are the consequences, both positive and negative, and also how can they be improved? In the interest of time today, I'll only really briefly present our findings to question 1 and to question 3. A bit of background to the methods that we used. Given the various interpretations and alternative terminologies of an area-based approach, we took a multi-pronged strategy to identifying the literature documenting such programs. So we firstly ran a broad scoping literature search to with key search terms through a variety of databases, including academic databases, humanitarian publications, online practitioner libraries, and working papers produced by academic institutions. We also then contacted a variety of practitioners and agencies directly, and we tapped into the Urban Response Community of Practice Network. So if anybody's online who responded to our request, thank you very much. We also supplemented this literature and document searching with a number of interviews with experts who'd been involved in implementing various urban programmes in recent crises, including a facilitated workshop at the UK Shelter Forum back in April. The purpose of this engagement was to focus on identifying relevant documents, especially those where different terms may have been used, to discuss our key findings and the themes that were emerging. There were, as with any research, a number of limitations, and the main one for us really in our research was that only documents available in English were able to be included in the review due to time and cost reasons. So I'll move on to the findings, the interesting part. So the first question we were asked was, what are area-based approaches to urban humanitarian crises? We found that there was no official definition in the literature, so that was a big question. How do we all know we're talking about the same thing? So we reviewed the documents we'd identified, including a number of different case studies, and based on that analysis as a starting point, both for discussion and to test, we proposed that area-based approaches in an urban context have three defining characteristics. They are geographically targeted, adopt a multi-sectoral and participatory approach. In this case, by participatory, we're really referring to the active engagement, active involvement, active participation of all relevant stakeholders in the area. That would be including residents, local government authorities, private sector and civil society organisations. Through our research, we proposed that what makes an area-based approach distinct is that all three characteristics are integral to its delivery. We recognise that this might not be a complete or definitive definition, but it is one based entirely on the available literature. But we also recognise that in this field, as in many, the vast majority of knowledge sits with practitioners, and what we know collectively as a sector is not necessarily the same as what we've written down collectively as a sector. So I'm really pleased to be able to present today and to have a bit more of a discussion, and we have a poll coming up later to hear a little bit more about your experiences as well. On this slide there's a couple of examples just to talk to. So the first one on your left is Delma 19, which is a British Red Cross project in Port-au-Prince following the 2010 earthquake. On this programme they used the term integrated neighbourhood approach, so it wasn't an area-based approach, it was an integrated neighbourhood approach. It took a participatory, so thinking back to the three defining characteristics, it took a participatory approach, mobilised local residents. In this instance there was 3 or 4 smaller socially defined communities that were in this area, which was an informal area, and the British Red Cross adopted the approach that the IFRC have been developing over the last couple of years called PASA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It was also a multi-sectoral programme. There was shelter, livelihoods and community health components, among many others, and it was geographically targeted. As you can see, there's a red line around the outside which defines where the boundaries of this programme will run. In total around 4,000 households were planned to benefit from different packages of shelter solutions, improved security and public health. The project on your right hand side, that's called the Kabul Area Shelter and Settlement Programme. That was a care programme in 2006, and the name that was used there was an integrated shelter-led humanitarian intervention. It took a participatory approach in such that it engaged key stakeholders such as the Kabul municipality and local residents also into many different aspects of the project, from beneficiary selection, choice of project sites, and ongoing project discussion and decision making. It took a multi-sectoral approach. There was shelter, water supply, sanitation, road upgrades and maintenance, ditch drainage, health education and hazard preparedness were all incorporated into the same programme. And you can also see that on this map this is only showing District 6, which is one of a number of different districts that they worked in, and of course this would be connected into the bigger city. In this case the maps were all hand drawn. on because there weren't up-to-date digital maps available. So a big question that arose out of our research as well was one of scale. Most of the case studies we identified were typically at a community or a neighbourhood level, especially in informal settlement areas, such as the one you can see on the left, or they were structured around administrative boundaries, such as district level, which is an example you can see on the right. As we were doing the research, a lot of people were asking us, can this approach be adopted citywide? And we said, well, our hypothesis is perhaps yes, but our research didn't identify any programs at this scale. But that doesn't mean to say that there hasn't been any. It just means that maybe they were called something different. Perhaps the documents weren't available in English, or maybe a different approach is required. So that's still a question mark that we went in my last few minutes. I'll just talk a little bit about the consequences, both positive and negative, that we found for agencies or others looking to implement area-based approaches. Our findings we drew from both humanitarian literature and developmental literature. So we concluded that area-based approaches are neither good nor bad, and that their positive and negative effects depend entirely on the context which they're conceived, their program design, and the manner of their delivery, and the appropriateness of adopting such a strategy. Potential positives, they can act as a catalyst for local change. They present effective mechanisms for focusing resources where they're needed. They can prevent or reduce consultation fatigue for disaster-affected populations. They can mobilise a bottom-up approach, and they can attract much-needed investment. Potential negatives, on the other hand, are that they can enhance inequality between target areas and surrounding areas. Also, they could potentially create a distraction from the underlying problem or shift responsibility onto the wrong stakeholder and prevent action. This is especially in instances where the underlying problems or vulnerabilities sit at a level that's bigger than the area that's been defined. And the last two, costly to implement and take a long time. This was mentioned very frequently throughout the literature. It was often framed such as it is more costly to implement, or it will take a longer time, but it was not always clarified, take a longer time than what, or more costly to implement than what. So there was limited evidence of what the comparison was with. But later on in the paper, the fourth question about how you can improve area-based approaches, the important factors there were how you can design your program and manage the risks in order to design out these negatives and design in the positives. And a lot of those were about decisions you make very early on in the program. So I think that's my time up. So we have a poll now to reflect a little bit on those three defining characteristics, how much they reflect your understanding of what an area-based approach is. We've called them defining characteristics because I think that this might change, but depending on, largely because the research that we did is based on what's been done so far. But I think another important question might be, is this the right thing to do? And so I'll pass over to Paul now, who will take over from me. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Elizabeth, you packed an awful lot into a very short time there, and we'll hear more about some of these ideas, I'm sure, in a minute. But before we do, we wanted to just do this poll because, as Elizabeth said, a lot of this is very difficult to really work on something or make it better if we're not agreed on what the thing is. And this has been part of the challenge, I think, for Elizabeth and Victoria in addressing the area-based approaches. So we thought we'd just get a sense from experts out there around the world, which is you, whether or not you agree with the definition that was just put forward. We'll put the final scores up after. I think we have 20% would say that this is exactly the right definition, and they'd agree with exactly with this definition. 50% broadly agree, 30% mostly agree. So we're getting very few not agreeing at all, or agreeing with some parts but making significant changes. Is that right there? Okay, so it sounds like we're more or less on course here. Thank you very much, everyone. We can use this, we can broadly use this, and I think we'll interrogate this definition a little bit as we go forward. But first, I'd just like to pick up on some questions that some of you sent in beforehand. And I think this is a good one, following up on really where Elizabeth left off. The approaches don't appear to be either intrinsically good or intrinsically bad, is what the report says. A lot of it is about how they are designed. And so I wondered, Holly, if we might go to you first, as someone who, someone who has a lot of experience in the design and implementation of these, to ask what are the barriers or challenges that you've found related to an area-based approach in an urban context, and maybe do you have any examples of how you may have attempted to overcome these barriers?
Yes, good evening. Thank you for the question. Here in Tacloban, we've been working on the Typhoon Haiyan recovery program for the last about a year and a half, and we have faced quite a few challenges in program implementation. So I've briefly outlined about 4 challenges and how we've addressed them. The first has to do with the multi-sectoral piece of the area-based approach. Obviously, for the different sectors, you need different type of staff from professional backgrounds in order to implement that project. Of course, the challenge becomes in a small geographic area like we have in Tacloban, where we're working in 17 neighborhoods that are very close together. It's how to schedule all of the different activities that we need to complete without overlapping or without causing neighborhood official fatigue or beneficiary fatigue. Because we're working with shelter, WASH, disaster risk reduction and protection, we do, there are many different trainings and many different activities that the neighborhood officials and other leaders as well as the community members need to attend. So we have tried to combine activities to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. So trying to combine the activities to get the same people that we need there in order to complete both of the activities. We've begun to engage and build the capacity recently of the local committees so that they are the ones that are in fact taking on more responsibility for organizing the trainings or for actually conducting the trainings when it's best for them and their constituents or their community members. In terms of the challenge that Elizabeth talked about with the surrounding areas, this is the case that we have faced this in Tacloban. We have received a lot of feedback or complaints from neighboring neighborhoods to the area where we work. Thankfully, in this particular project, we have very distinct landmarks that we're able to explain to people who come to our office asking for shelter support. We can say, these are our landmarks, and the neighborhoods that fall within that area are the ones that we are able to work with. So thankfully, that's been it's been relatively easy for us to be able to explain the geographic location. We're also working with constructing transitional relocation sites, which are actually outside of the neighborhoods where we're currently working. And so there are many informal settlers who are living very close to the transitional sites where we work. And so in Tacloban, there's been a very big shelter gap with many of the different barangays. There haven't been enough NGOs providing shelter support to cover all of the needs that occurred after Typhoon Haiyan. So currently we have 3 transitional relocation sites and many informal settlers around them that don't have access to good water or basic services like we have provided in the transitional shelter site just across the street. Another challenge is that the area-based approach does take a really, really long time. The project was originally a one-year project, and we were able to get an extension for an additional year. So it'll be about a 2-year project. There are different phases to the project. So we first started with cash for work for debris removal, and then we moved into shelter and latrine support. And then from there we were able to go into more of the neighborhood level support, such as drainage and other infrastructure projects that we're constructing. The challenge with this is when we first started back in February of 2014, we only had 2 engineers and 1 community organizer. At this point, we have about 60 staff working on the project. So at the beginning, we were very focused on the individual household level, and every time we started to roll out a new part of the project, we would need to go back and re-engage to explain the next phase of the project. We've recently expanded into 7 additional coastal barangays in Tacloban, and so thankfully we are learning and had the staff available to be able to do stakeholder meetings at the very beginning and explain all of the different phases of the project, which makes it easier to do action planning with the community leaders, as well as scheduling of activities across all of the sectors. And then the final challenge that I'll discuss is being dependent on the city government plans. Within Tacloban, the city government still has not announced what their plans are for the no-dwell zone or the danger area on the coast. There's a possibility that a large embankment project will come to fruition, which would negatively impact a lot of the infrastructure that we're currently building. But to date, there's been no announcement about that, and the only thing that we can do is continue to attend the meetings as well as communicate with the neighborhood. Of course, the city doesn't have the same timeline as our donor, so it just makes it a little more complicated to make good programmatic decisions when you're on someone who has a different timeline.
That's great. Thank you, Holly. I wondered if I might pick up on one thing there, of the many interesting points, because it's something that Elizabeth mentioned at the end of her presentation earlier. You say that it takes a long time, and I just wanted to come back to Elizabeth's question. A long time compared to what, I think, is how Elizabeth asked it. If we imagine that instead of taking this area-based approach, you were managing a variety of different sectoral programs, shelter, wash, and so on, the variety that's covered by the area-based approach that you're currently using. Do you think that the area-based approach takes more time than, and I know it's difficult to answer, but is taking more time than it would if you were doing all of these things separately? And if so, why?
It probably would actually take longer if we were doing it separately, but in terms of the original timeline of the project, which was a one-year project, we've now doubled that amount of time, and it will end up being a 2-year project. So perhaps more, rather than saying that it takes more time, maybe the better thing to say is we need to understand better what the possible timeline for a project to be able to implement the entirety of the project.
Thank you. That's a very helpful clarification, and we'd be very interested from anyone else who is online who has run or participated in this project to have their ideas type in on that particular question, or any of the others that are raised here. So please do type them in. Andrew, I'd like to turn to you now, if I may. Going back to this idea of definitions, and we've seen that there's sort of broad general agreement with the three-part definition that Elizabeth and Victoria have identified through the research that they've done. But there is also the question of defining the area in area-based programming. So when we're talking about area-based programming, in your experience, are we talking about the whole city? Are we talking about a single densely populated area, or a administrative district, or an informal neighborhood? How have, in your experience, have these boundaries been defined, and what are the implications of this? Does it actually matter, and if so, why?
Well, thanks, Paul. I think first, just to say quick thanks to Elizabeth and Victoria for the paper. Very excellent. I enjoyed reading it. But in terms of your question on defining the area, as I mentioned in the paper, in my experience, we begin with the administrative barriers or administrative boundaries. The reason for which is because of the generally accepted convention and the need to interact with such a broad spectrum of stakeholders, specifically local government and local communities. So then just to go on about what an example of that might be is perhaps after a baseline assessment of the population present in throughout the response area in the largest possible sense, looking at population densities and based on those densities, breaking the various sub-districts up according to population densities, let's say of approximately 5,000 families, so that each neighborhood now, or combination of neighborhoods depending on the density, can be defined as an individual area for the purpose of a humanitarian response.
That's very interesting, thank you. And I'd like to follow up on that, if I may, in just a second, Andrew. But first, I'll put the same question to Elizabeth, because I think you probably had some findings which you haven't had time to share with us, looking across the various different cases. So, same question to you, Elizabeth. How are people defining the area, and what are the implications?
I think building a lot on what Andrew said, really what came out of our research was that the administrative boundaries across the case studies that we'd identified really was one of the best places to start for the reason that Andrew explained, as well as it presents the best opportunity for partnering or working in a complementary way to local government. And other agencies also reported that it strengthened links between the communities and the government, because they had a clear structure to plug into, which also helped with early development of exit plans. So what happened when the agency's programme was finishing, as well as ongoing maintenance and management of assets that were maybe built or repaired or reconstructed through the programme. Another way that was often adopted in informal settlements, because of course, as we all know, informal settlements typically are located in the most vulnerable areas to natural disasters, and also the construction of the shelters, buildings may not be as good as in other areas of the city, which leaves the residents more vulnerable. So in these areas there's often more of a need for extra support, but they don't have the government structure that you would expect in a formal area, or maybe they have a governance structure that exists but isn't recognised formally anywhere. And in these instances, in informal settlements, often physical features, roads, rivers, very steep slopes, things like that became kind of where the boundaries were, or strong social communities, different religious communities, for example, living in a certain area. My personal perspective is that when thinking about defining an area, I think we need to avoid trying to develop a one-size-fits-all sort of definition. Like, I don't think we should be seeking to say an area and an area-based programme is always at a neighbourhood or a district or a city-wide level. I think it's important that we always think a lot more about the context and what's needed, and what would work best for that city or that town.
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. I'll just throw in an additional question to both of you, if I may. Maybe starting with you, Andrew, which is just taking this idea. What we're hearing here is very strong support for the idea of following administrative boundaries for where this is possible for the reasons that you outline. Where it's not possible, or where one's working at perhaps a smaller level, a smaller number of households or residential units level. The question that I wanted to ask was, there's often appears to be an assumption that there is a relationship between community and neighborhood, or community and location in urban areas, in the same way that in rural areas one thinks of the village as a community. Some of the area-based discussion does talk about communities and uses that term almost as if the area, the geographical area, is inevitably a community. And I wondered what your experience was of this. Are urban communities, in your experience, generally communities which are taking place in the same place, as it were, if you like, urban villages? Or are urban communities not so closely related to geography, or does it differ from one city to another? Andrew?
Let's see, I think that the way we define community is important to this discussion, of course. And I would say that we've discussed previously the administrative boundaries, and I would define community, at least for the sake of this discussion, as the anthropological boundaries of an urban environment or of any environment. And as Elizabeth had mentioned, I think how we define this for the purpose of area-based response is going to be needs to be contextual. And I can absolutely imagine a situation where it would be important to identify the community boundaries, and they would not necessarily line up with the administrative ones. And what are our implications of deciding to choose an administrative boundary or a community boundary in this situation? Are there protection implications? Are there historical tensions that we need to be aware of that don't necessarily play along the lines of the administrative layout of an urban environment? So I think that it behooves us. It's very important for us when looking at program design to be aware of not only administrative boundaries, but all of the other potential implications. And this would be part of an initial program assessment and trying to set up those maps and in coordination with not just local government, but local community members and community leaders.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting, Andrew. Thank you. I suppose as you're talking, I'm also wondering how this relates to the degree to which the program exists, if you like, to mirror and support existing communities, and the degree to which the program exists to actually build community or build social cohesion, because that's also something which one sees in some of these projects. You also had some very interesting thoughts there on mapping, and I'm sure quite a lot of our participants today would like to hear a bit more about that. Elizabeth, I wondered if I could just go back to you very briefly on this issue of area and community. Are they the same? Does it matter?
Yes, I think I might slightly disagree there with Andrew. I think when working in an urban context, I don't think it's really the most important thing. I don't think it matters too much, and I think that's because we have to think a lot more about how cities work and how they're governed, and I think governance is the key word here, not so much community, and that's quite a big shift for us because, like you say, we do, especially coming from rural backgrounds where a lot of our experience is based, we do talk about communities a lot, but I think we need to be careful about not using them too interchangeably. We try to talk a lot about residents, and I think that frees us up a little bit. Our research suggested that area-based approaches don't really assume that areas are the basis of community and urban development. There's such a lot of literature on urban communities, their diversity, their mobility, their networks that we can tap into. And as I mentioned earlier, and as we've just been discussing, it does seem that the favoured approach, or the favourite starting point for defining an area, is through administrative boundaries. And towns and cities do have administrative boundaries at a range of scale. When looking at ways that the humanitarian community is going to work in urban areas, that we're seeking to intervene at these levels where you have got an entry point. And I think it's that that question of where is your entry point, which is why we shouldn't necessarily be talking about so much about communities unless we're talking about informal areas where you perhaps don't have that same formal structure to tap into. And I think Holly was keen to answer this question as well, perhaps.
Yes, Holly, a very useful distinction there, Elizabeth, by the way. Andrew, I'll certainly give you an opportunity to come back on that later when we come to the next question. But maybe, Holly, do you have some thoughts on this?
I think that, obviously what works in a rural community development program is very different than in an urban context. In rural areas, you generally have a very homogeneous population and a very cohesive community. That's generally, or what we've seen, that may not be the case. And I think that we should distinguish between looking at individual household interventions versus the neighborhood level interventions. In terms of the neighborhood level interventions, for us that would be community-wide drainage or barangay or neighborhood infrastructure projects. Obviously the administrative boundary is going to be the most important because you can partner directly with the neighborhood officials to get buy-in and to get the resolutions passed that you need. But when you're looking at the household level, it's a little bit different. Even though they all live in the same area, in an urban environment, they may not know each other. In CRS, we've been doing conditional cash grants after Typhoon Haiyan in 2 rural municipalities as well as in Tacloban, an urban setting. We generally have we ask households to self-select into accountability groups. So that's a group of 10 households that they are under the understanding that for each cash payment that they receive, none of them will be able to move on to the next payment until all households finish. What we saw in the rural areas is that people would help each other out, let the other households borrow their carpenters or their materials so that they could all move forward. What we saw in the urban environment is that they may have self-selected into groups together, but that doesn't mean that they know or trust each other. And so we didn't see that same cohesive group mentality, which meant that what we were trying to implement was not actually working. And so we had to, in that case, totally do away with the group system, and people were actually, able to more quickly move through their conditional cash payments. We've also seen on a household level where we're offering both apartment rental subsidies as well as host family subsidies, and households are much more keen on choosing apartments because they have control over where they're going, versus the host family, wherever their family's living, that means that's where they have to go. So people would rather have control over their location versus their natural community.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, what I pick out of that I think is particularly interesting for programming terms is the idea that maybe this urban society being more atomized, arguably, into individual households or individual residential units, still is very heavily reliant on common goods like drainage, water supply, and so on, and so that there is almost paradoxically the possibility of dealing with this very high level of individuality by, to a degree, slightly focusing on these common areas. I think that's, for me anyway, a very interesting thought. Going to move forward a little bit onto a new question, because I think it comes almost directly from what you were saying about the moving from rural, if you like, rural participatory group approaches which rely on rural group and societal dynamics to urban participatory approaches. And Holly, if I can leave the question with you for a moment. You know, the question here is, how do area-based approaches increase the inclusion and participation of the population? We often think participation is almost a group activity, but you were speaking about some of the difficulties there. And so maybe you could speak a little bit more about the practical approaches that have been effective in including urban communities in urban-based programming. How have you brought all these very disparate individual households together in some form of participative manner?
For this project, we are doing a blanket approach to shelter and to individual shelter and latrine support. So regardless of economic status, all households who were whose shelters or latrines were affected by Typhoon Haiyan, we have been able to provide support. Of course, in an urban setting, there's a huge variation of living arrangements, which has been one challenge that we have had to manage. What we've seen is the need to have more clearly defined beneficiary criteria. For example, we offer one shelter or one latrine per household. A household could have 3 families or it could have 1 family. But within an urban context, because there's such a huge variety of living arrangements, we were not able to, at the beginning of the project, come up with very strict criteria. So that did cause a few difficulties later on. So even though we were including everybody without very clear definitions to allow to present to the community would come back and say, well, what about us? Or why aren't we being allowed to receive support? It also, at the start of the project, that was back in February of 2014, people were still living in tents and evacuation centers, and so we were trying to push forward as quickly as we could because we had a lot of pressure from the city to get people out of those circumstances and into safer and more durable shelters. So with that, we did not go through as much of a community, I guess, cleaning process of the neighborhood master list. So again, that caused problems for us. Recently, when we expanded into the additional 7 neighborhoods, we were able to do a much more clear process of beneficiary selection. So even though, again, it was a blanket approach, there were certain definitions that we needed to lay out so that people would know who could receive and who couldn't. So I think that the main lesson here that we have learned is just trying to get more buy-in from the neighborhood officials and from the leaders as well as the community to fully understand the inclusiveness of the project while at the same time having the clear beneficiary selection criteria.
Great. I'll hand this question again over to you, Andrew, because I see a sort of continuation from some of the things we were discussing earlier, particularly, of course, if the one way of achieving participation, if there is a local government structures which are representative, is that people will be represented through those local government structures, but that's obviously not always the case. So on this and on the previous question, maybe running some of those ideas together, what have your observations been in terms of how these approaches can potentially increase inclusion and participation, and practically what is required to do that?
Thanks, Paul. I think for me, this question falls into 2 primary elements. One is accountability, and I mean, we know that definition well enough. I won't go into that in detail, but to say accountability to this population that we're trying to engage with, and sustainability of the project, rather, in terms of, if we're really hoping to make any gains in these programs in which don't engage the population, then how sustainable are those gains really, and how likely are they to come back? For me, coming from the CCCM sector, the methodology for us is looking at participation and active engagement of a formal displacement site, a collective center or a camp, is a cornerstone to the response. And so for us, understanding community leadership structures and or facilitating the establishment of those structures in order to engage the population, active participation of this population in the site, to move all elements of site life forward are critical. And so the main tool there is essentially ensuring adequate empowerment of the population in all sectors of the response in a formal site to move this forward. And so looking now, transferring that learning into an urban approach is something that we're trying to pilot now. And so for in urban areas, I think trying to run a program without the engagement of both formal and informal leadership structures risks even being impossible. Without getting the buy-in of local structures, local population and leadership, are we potentially alienating them? Are we creating potential problems that weren't there before? So I think for those questions, I mean, one, accountability. It should be a response. It's something we should do. We have a responsibility to engage in. But sustainability, making sure that those gains don't just die off when inevitably the humanitarian response begins to close up.
Thanks. And I'm wondering, you mentioned formal and informal. Of course, the formal leadership structures are hopefully fairly easy to identify. You rock up to the village hall or whatever. The informal leadership structures, how would one go about? Does one wait for them to come to you? Or you talked about sort of mapping and sort of assessments, social assessment earlier on. I wondered what the experience of identifying these formal leadership structures have been, informal leadership structures, sorry, have been.
Yeah, I think that's really important, this anthropological element to our humanitarian response. And in CCCM, it's something that we deal with a lot. I would say it's generally identified based on community engagement, and whether that's through individual staff or creating different opportunities. I would actually suggest a multitude of different opportunities to look at community engagement are required to identify and fully appreciate the informal community leadership structures. Sometimes historical information may be available to try and actually physically map out the locations of these communities, but I think most importantly for us in terms of humanitarian programming, it's important to understand who those informal leaders are, what are their role in this community, or even within the population that we're working with, and how sometimes I think the success of a project hinges on the advocacy and buy-in of these informal leaders. And so whether that's through key informant interviews or perhaps it's even easier, you know, maybe it's an elder that everyone knows and goes to. But community engagement leading to an opportunity to not only to discover but to engage the informal leadership structures, and thereby creating the buy-in that you need to make your project successful.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And again, if anyone has, I'm sure that there are people taking part, listening out there, sending in questions out there who have done this for themselves. And so if any of you have any tips or experience about this that you would like to share, we would love to put it up on the Community of Practice. Similarly, any links to documentation or reports or research that talk about how some of these issues can be addressed, we'd welcome that so that we can share it more broadly. Elizabeth, I might go to you and back to the report for a minute, if we may, because in the report, in the research you did note that there was some significant gaps in the evidence. Some of them were that there were no examples that you identified in short-term emergency response, and that it was quite geographic, so some continents didn't have, geographical continents didn't have examples. And I wondered, were you able to form an impression of whether this is because this approach just doesn't work in those areas, and so that there's there are no written examples, or is it just a documentation gap?
This is a great question, and one that I think as a researcher you can never answer. We asked ourselves the same thing throughout the research, and we have a number of responses really. One of the things I mentioned earlier was that we weren't able to include literature that wasn't available in English, and also because of the wide range of terms used to describe similar programs. Those two factors really could mean that whilst there are documents available in English, we weren't searching for the right term. We used a lot of different terms to find the documents that we were able to include. But I think, especially delving into more developmental literature, there would be a huge, I think there's a huge amount of learning that we can take from that, but the terms are of course entirely different. So due to the limitations of our research approach, it is possible that there's a gap in documentation, and that area-based approaches have been used in short-term emergency responses, but using a different name, or perhaps they're documented in Spanish or Arabic. But from an evidence-based perspective, it would be difficult to say that something doesn't work unless it has been tried and tested and documented. But we could build on the research we have undertaken and the information we know already, especially about the possible positive and negative consequences of adopting area-based approaches that we've been talking through. And we could ask ourselves, would that work in this instance? So, for example, in a short-term emergency, do we have enough time to bring together local stakeholders meaningfully? Do we have the right staff with the right skills to facilitate detailed and often roundabout negotiations about long-term plans for the area, etc.? So I think we can take what we know and say, in these areas where we're not sure if there's documentation, how would this work? How would this apply? What would be the reality of this? And I guess finally, I would probably say we only included literature that was available at the time, and I think that this is a topic that there's a great deal of interest in at the moment. Case studies that come out over the next couple of years that we can really tap into.
So just taking that thought a bit further forward, because you started there something which I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in, almost a checklist of conditions which need to be in place really to sort of suggest that this is going to be successful. And you talked about having the time, having the skills, and we heard from Holly earlier the research, put onto that checklist of things that our participants, if they were considering area-based approaches, really would need to ensure that they had in place. And or similarly, are there any situations in which, on the basis of the research, you'd say, well, it's really not very likely to happen and people should be very skeptical before starting area-based approaches?
That is a great question, and I think that is a research paper in its own right. I think we can only really extrapolate from what we know. I think it would be hard to say, yes, this is a definitive, checklist or something like that, because like I said, the documentation that we have available that we were able to include in the review is not sufficiently comprehensive, I think, to say, this is best practice or this is good practice. I think we're at the stage now where we can say these are lessons learnt, but I don't think we can categorically say this is how you should do it, which I think you would need the confidence. And there are a number of possible things or characteristics to look out for, and I guess as well it would be the relationship between the context that you're in and how you design your program. So if you find yourself in a certain situation and you're saying, do I have am I working in an area where government officials have sufficient capacity to engage with me? That would be, I think it would be less of a checklist, more of a series of starting questions, which would then help inform how you design your program. So something more like that. So, for example, one of the questions would be, I need to define the boundaries of the area where I'm working. I think that I'll start with the administrative boundaries, like Andrew was saying. Do local government agencies or officials that I would need to engage with have sufficient capacity? And then through finding out the answer to that, you'd be able to tailor your program. So perhaps they do, and that's great, and then you can engage them. Perhaps they don't, and then you have to think about what you need to do in order to make sure that your program or the outputs or the outcomes of your program are sustainable. Another important one that Holly touched on earlier was around linking with wider city or regional plans. That's critical. That was one of the key learnings from our research, that's so important in order to avoid isolated urban island programs. I think they've been referred to as, where you target one very clearly defined area and you're pumping a lot of support into that area, but all the surrounding areas don't get the same level of assistance, and it can create a great deal of tension and animosity, and that can escalate quite quickly. The starting question there would be, what existing city or regional plans are there? And now if it's a rapid onset disaster such as an earthquake, there may be existing ones, but they may have changed. If it's a slow onset disaster or conflict situation, that would be different again. And I think, like Holly says, in a rapid onset disaster, often those plans they're developing at the same time as your program's developing, so it can become very difficult, a kind of a chicken and egg situation. What comes first? And so you then have to plan your program around that, and there's different approaches. So I have a project management background, and so one of the most important things that we often do is write down assumptions, because you find it's very rarely done. So that would be something you would do around that. Our assumptions are X, Y, and Z. You probably actually have pages of them, but that's where you'd start. And as the program moves forward, you'd regularly come back and say, how are these assumptions? Do they still stand true? What do we know that's different? And then you'd need to make sure that you have the flexibility to change them, and you can think about that in advance, so that you're being proactive rather than reactive. So that was just two. I think that was just two starting questions, but I think that's how probably, I think there's a lot more, but I think perhaps you don't want me to talk about them to go on too long, so I'll probably stop there.
I'll tell you what, thank you very much. I think this idea of starting questions is superb. I wonder if we could ask Holly, from your experience, if you could build on that list of questions. I mean, some that we're hearing so far, if I can abstract from the conversation we've had, Elizabeth was already saying, do I know the area I'm working in? Do I know that the government has capacities in that area? Are there wider city level plans? I think, Holly, you'd mentioned earlier on, do I have skills and capacities? Do I have the sufficient skills within my organisation to do this? Do I know who has power and influence in this area is one that we've talked about. But as Elizabeth said, there are probably many more starting questions. So Holly, would you have any other really burning things that people should ask themselves before initiating an area-based program?
The only other thing I could think of, I think this is a pretty comprehensive list, is just in terms of the donor. A lot of times donors come with very kind of strict timelines and strict definitions of what they want, and so depending on who your donor is and how strict they are, does their timeline, I guess, meet up with a area-based approach, and are they flexible enough to understand that as the program develops over time, different needs are going to come out of engaging with the community and engaging with the city officials and engaging with the neighborhood officials.
Thank you. And how has this been, without going too much into your relationship with your donors, but if you don't mind me asking, has this been something that you've found easy to do, a discussion you've found that has been easy to have or hard to have? And how have you been able to build in this sort of flexibility and the ability to respond to unexpected but legitimate requests from the people with whom you're working?
Thankfully, our donor is a very, very, very flexible donor. I think the one challenge, our donor mainly focuses on natural disasters or conflict areas, so they're looking at the immediate response and recovery. And so when we needed to extend our project by another year in order to complete all of the targets that we had set for ourselves, including for transitional shelter. We're still at this point, a year and a half later, doing transitional shelter. They've been very, very great about extending kind of the paperwork or the bureaucratic parts of, I guess, the timeline. But there is a bit of pressure from them saying, hey, it's been a year and a half. Why are we still doing transitional shelter? So I think that, you know, that is one piece. But on the other hand, you know, when we were offering our shelter solutions for relocation, and we saw that people were very, very hesitant to leave, and we decided to take 1,400 households up to the permanent shelter relocation site that the city government and NHA are building or constructing together. You know, we did have the flexibility to say, you know what, we need to put other programmatic things on hold to take these 1,400 households up to see what they could potentially be receiving in 2 or 3 years' time. And we were able to get a really great response from those households to say, okay, we understand now why CRS is offering us transitional shelter. The permanent shelter site is not ready. It's not going to be ready for several years. So now we need to, you know, figure out what to do in the meantime, and CRS is providing us that support. So, you know, our donor is very flexible, and we've been able to really, you know, as the project moves forward, you know, innovate different activities or, you know, strategies to help us, you know, manage the needs that are coming up in the project. But I do think that the timeline of providing transitional shelter is it's a little more challenging to explain why we need so much time to complete that aspect of the project.
Thank you, thank you. I'd like to turn now to one of the things that we've touched on, but I don't think we've looked at in great detail, which is we've looked at the geographical part, and I think we've looked at the participatory part. Maybe turning a little bit more now to the multi-sectoral element of area-based programming. Andrew, in your experience, I wonder, with the multi-sectoral element of this, which indicators are used? One of our participants has asked, which indicators are used? And how, when you've got different sectors working to a common program, are the different sectors accountable to sort of integrated multi-sectoral indicators?
Yeah, I hate to maybe go back, but if, with your permission, I'd like to just touch on one point about the limits. I think one of the things that limits, or the limits that are part of an area-based approach, are that it's collaborative, and this is it's a blessing and a curse. And why is it what's the potential drawback? Is that collaboration is always slow, and so that's one of the limits, is that this is very slow because of all those involved, and it plays into that multi-sector element. The other element is that, and this is always the case, we're guests. And so in an area, though, this type of program where we're much more directly involved potentially with local government, they may have a very different idea of how implementation or what gets implemented. And so I think just a couple of thoughts on limits. To go to what you were mentioning about the indicators, I think for me this plays a little bit into also the previous question on starting questions, is how do we identify that area, the area that we'd like to intervene in? Why are we intervening in area A and not area B? In my experience, these indicators make up a part of a baseline assessment. And if we're looking at the initial phases of a humanitarian emergency response, these indicators should be core life-saving indicators that, when put together, can be quickly collected, are designed not to be extremely detailed, not to be sufficient to design necessarily a whole program, but in place to, let's say, take the pulse of the situation and then create a ranking of these areas according to most vulnerable. This then prioritized list according to vulnerability of areas can be used to support very transparent and informed decision making about which areas to intervene in and how to intervene in them. To be more specific about the indicators, I wouldn't say necessarily that we have a list of go-to, again, at the initial phase when we're talking about emergency. These should be indicators that are indicative of or measure life-saving needs of populations in each of these areas, and it should be done collaboratively, as in whoever is coordinating the assessment is not making decisions on behalf of the other sectors about what information should be collected. It's a joint initiative that should be done as quickly as possible and implemented. Once a specific area or the areas have been identified and partners or actors have been are going to move into place to intervene in a specific area, indicators there again would be drawn up and be more specific to the type of needs expressed in that baseline. Because just to stress that like the program, the indicators should be multi-sectoral, should focus at least initially on saving lives and then get down to specific program intervention requirements. And I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks. I wonder, Andrew, if there are any particular, if you could recommend to us any particular sort of baseline assessment tools that you've come across, or that you've seen used elsewhere. If there's anything that's particularly useful for doing these various analyses that we've talked about. I'll ask you first. I'll then go to our other speakers just to see if anyone's got any ideas that on assessment tools that can be used that are very particularly useful for area-based approaches.
Sure. I think to say that there's a specific tool for the overall baseline of the overall assessments related to area-based approach, I would say no. There are, let's say my approach would be to consider it more as a toolbox with a bunch of different tools that are appropriate to different contexts. One of the tools that I most appreciated using was the ODK on a mobile data collection platform. And in a situation where there's adequate cell coverage and so on, this approach for us was very well used, extremely fast, with real-time information coming in as soon as the data collectors were able to connect to the internet. And so I think that for me, that was one of the most effective and efficient tools that I was really enjoyed working with. Otherwise, very solid information management staff who understand the context, who are good at coordinating, and who really have a strong command of the assessment tools in their toolbox. It can be flexible. I think we talked about that a few times.
Great. Certainly this issue of geo-referenced information is particularly important, I'd imagine, for area-based programming, and I would advise those of you who weren't able to participate in the previous webinar on this topic to look there also for some tools. I'd also like to thank Megan Passy, I hope, Megan, I'm pronouncing that correctly, for reminding us on the issue of indicators that there is an humanitarian indicator registry with core indicators for each cluster, which is publicly available and which Megan says is a great baseline for this, this type of information. Holly, I wonder if I could ask you about any specific assessment tools that you used about vulnerability, but first of all, baseline assessments.
Our baseline assessment was actually conducted before I arrived. What I can tell you is that because we're working on it in so many different sectors with a lot of different activities, we have 53 indicators that we are measuring throughout the project. So I would agree that having a good database and information management system is absolutely essential, and having the staff understand kind of the full scope of all of the different indicators and parts of the project it's absolutely vital to making sure that all sectors of the project are moving forward in a cohesive manner. We have used a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, to actually take an aerial shot over our project area back in February of 2014, and with that image we've been able to hire GIS specialists to connect our database with that image and digital footprints of each of the different households that we're working with. So again, it's a high, I would say a high degree of technology, and it's just important that the M&E staff and the program staff are communicating and collaborating to ensure that everyone, you know, understands the full project and everything that needs to be measured and how the technology can help.
Thanks, Holly. It sounds to me like we're adding in our starter questions or starting questions the question of, you know, do we have the information management capacity to pull this off? Because it does seem to be coming through as an important element in these successful programs. I wondered also if I could ask you a separate question, but one that we've touched on, which also has come in from a colleague here who's taking part in the webinar, and that's this. In your experience, has it, the area-based approach that you've been using in Tacloban, has it made it easier or more difficult to identify the most vulnerable people? And in general, you know, what sort of approaches have you taken to ensure that you're prioritizing those people who are most vulnerable or most affected?
Because we are doing blanket coverage, like I said, we're not, you know, choosing people based on their economic status. So, and I would say that in some ways it does make it more difficult to identify the most vulnerable, precisely because we're not necessarily asking their, you know, their economic status or their land ownership status, etc. If we were using a different selection criteria, then I think we could identify the most vulnerable easier. In terms of prioritizing the most vulnerable, I think that that this can be the case very often in shelter responses, that there are certain documents that we need in order to move forward with providing a structure on a piece of land. And the people that are able to give us the land title or their deed of sale or their tax certificate for that piece of land oftentimes are the ones who are the least vulnerable. So when we were starting the project, again, because we were facing so much pressure from the city, as well as the clock ticking with our donor, you know, households that could come to us with all of the documents that we were requiring did in fact receive support before an informal settler who wasn't able to get the documents. With time, we've been able to work with households much more in order to help them get the documents. We also have a paralegal on staff who is working with households as well as National Statistics Office to recover civil documents that many of the households need, not only to get our support, but, you know, to enroll their children in school or you know, receive other benefits from the government. So I'm not sure if that totally answered the question.
I think it's a very helpful answer to the question. From what I hear you saying, I mean, there are challenges in working with the most vulnerable or the most affected people, partly coming out of the area-based approach, but also coming out of the realities of shelter programming more generally, which we've all come across, the difficulties around land tenure and rights to construct. So not all of the difficulties are just around the vulnerable people are inherent in the area-based approach itself. Some of them are common to other approaches to shelter programming, but that also that you have attempted and have had some success in overcoming this, but it is not easy and it requires additional resources. And I think that's probably worth bearing in mind. More generally, as well as within the context of area-based approaches. So I recognize that we recognize, all of us, I think, that there aren't easy answers to these things, but it is very useful to hear how CRS has gone about addressing this in the past. Elizabeth, I wonder if I could go back to you. We have a question here about an issue which has come up a couple of times, which is this thing about the other areas. So those areas which are outside the area that the area-based approach is working on. And in the work that you were looking at, did you find that programs had generally needed to or worked to get any form of approval or support from outside the area, or was most of the work with government and most of the work with community being done inside the area? Was it important to reach out beyond the boundaries?
So yes, there was a lot of information that we found around other areas, and big questions being raised about equity. Why would you work in one area and not another? And especially in the developmental literature, we found a lot of interesting information about how really, and I guess this does link back to the earlier question about how you identify the most vulnerable people, because you're really seeking to identify the most vulnerable area, or the area that most needs extra support. There was some discussion and some advice coming out of some of the interviews that we did with practitioners about how you do potentially blur the lines between the area where you defined where your program is going to be run and the surrounding areas. For example, extending some aspects of the project into the neighbouring areas, especially what you might refer to as some of the kind of soft support, psychosocial support, training, things like that. That could be extended out, or the people in the surrounding areas could be invited to the training or similar support within the project. Or if your area-based approach includes larger interventions or investments, such as healthcare centres or other community facilities, locating them across or along the boundary lines was suggested as a positive way of making sure that there was less of a kind of us and them divide to ease the tension. But I think, and I think linking back to what Andrew was saying about how you decide which areas you do work in, I think that's just where the decision has to sit. And I think that's a step change as well, because you're not saying, and linking to the other question, not saying how do you identify the most vulnerable people. It's really the question of how do you identify the most vulnerable area. And across the literature we reviewed, that seemed to be where area-based approaches were most effective, where you had areas that specifically required additional assistance. They were the most deprived areas, they were in the most vulnerable locations, and I think that also recognises that working at a city scale or a bigger scale than an individual household is just really important. Is really important in cities and towns.
Thank you. Now I'm conscious of time. I'm also conscious that we have many questions left unanswered. We've got a question here which I think is particularly interesting. I'm going to put it to all three of our participants today and ask you to try and keep the responses quite brief. The question is, do we need an area-based coordination structure to replace the clusters? Or do we think there are ways of making the existing, obviously sectoral-based coordination structure more effective in urban areas and in multi-sectoral programming more generally? Let me go first to Andrew with that, if I may.
From a CCCM perspective, the answer is absolutely yes. With an admittedly small footprint, and we're trying to implement initial pilots that are looking at taking a CCCM area-based approach. So essentially looking at a camp management team and the multi-sectoral approach that they're looking at in camps, so already engaging with. So just to say quickly that looking at how to apply that kind of model in an area-based approach is something we're trying to pilot now. And if indeed, and I think that the criticism is certainly or viable or appropriate, that we've been, and not everywhere, but in many cases, we've been insufficiently supporting host communities and looking at target populations in urban environments. And so I think some form of coordination mechanism is definitely required.
Great. Holly, I don't know if you can hear us. If you can, your thoughts about the clusters. Do we need to change them, or do we just need to adapt them?
From a programmatic implementation standpoint, I would definitely say that an area-based coordination mechanism would have been extremely useful back when the project was just starting. If I wanted to know what was going on all of the different sectors that we are working on in the project, I would have had to go to, maybe 4 different cluster meetings. So it would have been much more efficient and effective for me to just go to one area-based meeting.
Thank you, Holly. And finally, on the same question, Elizabeth, your thoughts on the clusters and area-based coordination?
I think here I would probably have a caution about changing a system that hasn't been established too long in order to adopt one specific approach. I think what we need is a coordination system that's flexible, and in this situation, I think that in any city you wouldn't just be adopting. You wouldn't have all agencies only adopting area-based approaches. You would have some taking a targeted, individual most vulnerable households approach. You'd have some perhaps taking a cash approach or a systems-based approach, looking at the infrastructure, or maybe an institution-based approach. You'd have a range of different approaches. And I think perhaps in this situation or in this context, what's missing is the coordination at a city level, rather than having lots and lots and lots of different area-based approach coordination mechanisms. You look at overall who's doing what within that city. That would be my personal view or suggestion.
Thank you very much, and thank all 3 of you very much for your thoughts on this. We will hopefully continue this conversation in the community of practice. Particularly interesting, I think, if anyone, any of our 3 panelists or anyone else has thoughts on this issue of the clusters, thoughts on additional starting questions that we didn't cover, on assessment tools, or any of the other issues that we've raised here, do please write in with either questions or ideas so we can share them more widely. Before we go, we wanted to do one final poll, which you'll see on the screen now, which is, after this discussion today, what do you think about area-based approaches for urban response? Should programming always sometimes be area-based, generally not be area-based, or do we need more evidence before recommending area-based programming? We just wanted to take the temperature here, so please vote now. Okay, and looking at this, what we're seeing is broadly the group agrees with the recommendation of Elizabeth and Victoria's research, which is programming coordination in urban areas should sometimes be area-based. 70% is saying that, 10% more evidence needed, 20% it should always be area-based. So that's very interesting. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. Thank you very much to our guests. Thank you very much for everyone who sent in questions and participated. We look forward to welcoming you in the next ALNAP Urban webinar, and would very much like you to fill in the questionnaire that we'll send you, because we do use these questionnaires to adapt the format and content of our webinars. For now, however, with final thanks, we wish you the very best, and we'll speak to you soon. Goodbye.